What happens when a five-star general, drunk on victory and convinced of his own genius, forgets that even legends must answer to someone? On April 11, 1951, President Harry S. Truman sat behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, pen in hand, about to sign a document that would shake the foundations of American military tradition and send shockwaves across the entire free world. The man he was about to fire wasn't just any general. He was Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander who had accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the architect of the Incheon landing, the hero who had waded ashore in the Philippines declaring, "I shall return," and a figure so revered that some whispered he might one day occupy the very office from which Truman now prepared to end his career. But this wasn't about jealousy or politics in the petty sense. This was about something far more fundamental to the survival of American democracy. The principle that, in the United States of America, the military serves the civilian government, not the other way around. For months, MacArthur had been making policy statements that contradicted his commander-in-chief, threatening to expand the Korean War into China, issuing ultimatums to enemy forces without authorization, and conducting what amounted to his own foreign policy from his headquarters in Tokyo. Truman, a former artillery captain from World War I who understood military discipline in his bones, had watched this insubordination grow like a cancer, threatening to drag America into a catastrophic Third World War before the nation had even recovered from a second. The question wasn't whether MacArthur was a brilliant military mind. He undoubtedly was. But whether any general, regardless of his genius or popularity, could be allowed to defy the elected leadership of the nation and survive. What happened next would define the relationship between military power and democratic governance for generations to come, and the confrontation between these two men would become one of the most dramatic constitutional crises in American history. If you've ever wondered how democracy survives when its greatest heroes threaten to become its greatest danger, then subscribe to this channel right now because you need to hear this story. Hit that like button if you believe that no one, no matter how decorated or beloved, should be above accountability. Share this video with someone who needs to understand why civilian control of the military matters more than any single battle or any single general. And leave a comment telling me if you knew about this constitutional crisis before today, or what part of this story surprises you the most, because the details of how Truman checkmated MacArthur reveal lessons about power that every generation needs to relearn. The seeds of this confrontation were planted long before 1951, rooted in MacArthur's personality and the unique trajectory of his career. Born in 1880 at the Little Rock Barracks in Arkansas, Douglas MacArthur grew up in a military family where his father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., had won the Medal of Honor during the Civil War and served as a general in the Philippines. Young Douglas absorbed a sense of destiny from childhood, graduating first in his class from West Point in 1903 with the highest honors in the Academy's history up to that point. By World War I, he had become the youngest divisional commander in the American Expeditionary Forces, leading the 42nd Rainbow Division with flamboyant bravery that earned him decorations but also criticism for unnecessary risk-taking and self-promotion. In the decades that followed, MacArthur's career oscillated between triumph and controversy. He became the youngest ever superintendent of West Point, the Army Chief of Staff during the Great Depression, and then accepted an extraordinary position as Field Marshal of the Philippine Army, a title no other American officer had ever held. When World War II erupted and Japanese forces invaded the Philippines in December 1941, MacArthur's defense was catastrophic, marked by crucial errors in judgment that left American and Filipino forces trapped on Bataan and Corregidor. Yet when Roosevelt ordered him evacuated to Australia in March 1942, MacArthur's dramatic escape and his famous "I shall return" proclamation transformed a military failure into a propaganda victory. His subsequent island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, culminating in his triumphant return to the Philippines in October 1944 and his acceptance of Japan's surrender in September 1945, made him perhaps the most celebrated American of his generation. As supreme commander of the Allied powers in occupied Japan, MacArthur wielded power that more closely resembled that of a shogun than a conventional military commander, reshaping Japanese society, writing their constitution, and governing with an autonomy that Washington found convenient when it suited their purposes and alarming when it didn't. When North Korean forces crashed across the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, plunging the Korean peninsula into war, MacArthur was 70 years old and had spent the previous 5 years essentially ruling Japan as an American proconsul. Truman, who had become president upon Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945 and won a shocking upset election in his own right in 1948, made the fateful decision to commit American forces to defend South Korea under the banner of the United Nations. MacArthur was the obvious choice to command this operation, given his experience, his proximity in Tokyo, and his unmatched prestige, But the assignment would prove to be a marriage of convenience that concealed fundamental disagreements about strategy, about China, about the nature of the conflict itself, and ultimately about who had the authority to make these decisions. In the early months, the war went disastrously for the United Nations forces as the North Korean People's Army pushed the Americans and South Koreans into a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. Then MacArthur produced one of the most brilliant military operations in American history, the amphibious landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950, a daring assault on a port with some of the worst tidal conditions in the world, which nearly every other military expert had warned against. The Incheon landing was a spectacular success, cutting North Korean supply lines and trapping their army in the south, and within weeks MacArthur's forces had recaptured Seoul and destroyed much of the North Korean military as an effective fighting force. Emboldened by this victory and encouraged by Washington's own ambiguous signals about reunifying Korea, MacArthur pushed north across the 38th parallel in October 1950, advancing toward the Yalu River and the Chinese border with a confidence that bordered on hubris. He dismissed warnings that China might intervene, assuring Truman during their only face-to-face meeting on Wake Island on October 15, 1950, that Chinese intervention was unlikely and that if it came, American air power would slaughter any Chinese forces that attempted to cross the Yalu. MacArthur was catastrophically wrong, and the price of his overconfidence would be paid in American blood. On October 25, 1950, Chinese volunteer forces struck the advancing UN columns in the rugged mountains of North Korea, and what began as isolated contacts soon revealed itself to be a massive intervention by the People's Liberation Army. By late November, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops had poured across the Yalu River under cover of darkness, infiltrating through the mountainous terrain and preparing a devastating counteroffensive that would become one of the most harrowing retreats in American military history. The Chinese struck with overwhelming force on November 25, 1950, slamming into the overextended and divided UN forces that MacArthur had rashly pushed too far north, too fast, across terrain that favored the defender and in brutal winter conditions that froze weapons and claimed lives through exposure as readily as through combat. The Eighth Army in the west and X-Corps in the east found themselves facing a human wave assault of Chinese infantry who moved at night, attacked from unexpected directions, and employed bugle calls and psychological warfare that terrified troops unprepared for this kind of combat. MacArthur's response to this disaster revealed both his tactical brilliance and his growing detachment from reality. While he successfully orchestrated a fighting withdrawal that saved his forces from complete annihilation, including the epic retreat of the 1st Marine Division from the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950, he simultaneously began a campaign of public statements blaming Washington for his failure, demanding authority to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria, to blockade the Chinese coast, and even to use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan in a counteroffensive against the mainland. These proposals, which MacArthur pushed relentlessly through official and unofficial channels throughout the winter of 1950-51, represented a fundamental challenge to Truman's limited war strategy. The President, along with his advisors including Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had concluded that expanding the war to China risked bringing the Soviet Union into the conflict and potentially triggering World War III, a nuclear war that could destroy civilization itself. MacArthur viewed these concerns as timidity and seemed genuinely to believe that his military judgment should override political considerations, that wars should be fought to absolute victory rather than limited objectives, and that his understanding of Asia gave him insights that the civilians in Washington simply could not comprehend. The constitutional crisis deepened through the early months of 1951 as MacArthur continued to make public statements that directly contradicted established policy. On March 7, 1951, he told a reporter that the decision to limit the war to Korea was an enormous handicap, without precedent in military history, a direct criticism of his civilian superiors that violated the most basic protocols of military subordination. On March 20, 1951, Truman prepared a statement offering to negotiate with China and North Korea, a diplomatic initiative designed to end the war short of total victory. But before this statement could be released, MacArthur issued his own unauthorized communique on March 24, 1951, essentially demanding that the Chinese commander meet with him to discuss surrender terms, threatening to expand the war if they refused, and sabotaging Truman's diplomatic efforts with what amounted to an ultimatum, delivered by a military commander acting without civilian authorization. Truman later wrote that this was the moment he decided MacArthur had to be relieved, that no president could tolerate a military commander conducting his own foreign policy, but the president moved carefully because he understood the political firestorm that would follow. The final provocation came on April 5, 1951, when Republican House Minority Leader Joseph Martin read on the floor of Congress a letter he had received from MacArthur, in which the general wrote that there is no substitute for victory, and suggested that nationalist Chinese forces should be unleashed against communist China, directly contradicting the administration's policy of avoiding a wider war. This letter, which MacArthur knew would be made public when he sent it to a Republican congressman critical of Truman's policies, was not just policy disagreement. It was open insubordination, a military commander publicly siding with the political opposition against his commander-in-chief's strategy. Truman consulted with Marshall, Atchison, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of whom agreed that MacArthur had to be relieved, though they understood the political consequences would be severe given MacArthur's popularity and the frustration many Americans felt about the stalemated war. On the evening of April 10, 1951, Truman made his final decision, and orders were prepared to relieve MacArthur of all his commands, as Supreme Commander Allied Powers in Japan, as Commander-in-Chief United Nations Command, and as Commander-in-Chief Far East. Right now, at the exact midpoint of this story, I need you to understand something crucial about what you're witnessing. This isn't just ancient history. This is the moment that established the principle that would protect American democracy through every subsequent crisis involving military power and civilian authority. Subscribe to this channel if you believe these lessons matter today. Hit that like button if you think standing up for constitutional principles requires courage regardless of political cost. Share this video with someone who needs to understand why limits on military power matter even in wartime. And leave a comment telling me whether you think Truman made the right decision or whether MacArthur should have been given the authority he demanded to expand the war into China. The manner of MacArthur's dismissal almost undermined the justification for it, revealing the human imperfections behind even the most momentous historical decisions. Truman intended for MacArthur to be informed privately and with dignity before any public announcement, with Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, who was visiting Korea, designated to deliver the message personally. But on the morning of April 11, 1951, the White House learned that the Chicago Tribune was about to break the story, having gotten wind of the decision through leaked information, and Truman faced the prospect of MacArthur learning of his firing through the press. At 1 a.m. Washington time on April 11, 1951, which was 3 p.m. in Tokyo, Truman's press secretary hastily called a special press conference to announce that the president had relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of all his commands and was replacing him with Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway. MacArthur, who had not yet been reached by official channels, learned of his dismissal from a radio news bulletin that interrupted his lunch at the American Embassy in Tokyo, a humiliating end to a 52-year military career that had seen him rise to heights few American officers had ever reached. The general's wife Jean later described how MacArthur turned pale when he heard the announcement, and though he maintained his composure, the method of his dismissal, learning of it through a commercial radio broadcast rather than through official military channels, added a layer of personal injury that would fuel his anger and his subsequent campaign against Truman. The official order, when it finally arrived, was brief and devastating. I deeply regret that it becomes my duty as President and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Military Forces to replace you as Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief, Far East, and Commanding General, U.S. Army, Far East. It was signed simply, Harry S. Truman, and it ended the career of the most celebrated general of his generation with the stroke of a pen, executed by a president whose approval ratings were plummeting and who knew he was about to face a political firestorm unlike any in recent American history. The reaction in the United States was immediate, visceral, and revealed deep divisions in American society about the war, about presidential authority, and about MacArthur himself. When the news broke on the morning of April 11, 1951, Republicans in Congress erupted in fury, with Senator Joseph McCarthy calling for Truman's impeachment, Senator Robert Taft declaring it a tragedy, and Representative Martin, whose letter from MacArthur had been the final straw, accusing Truman of firing MacArthur to cover up his own failed policies. In towns and cities across America, the reaction was even more personal and more emotional, with the White House receiving thousands of telegrams running overwhelmingly against the president's decision, newspapers filled with letters demanding Truman's removal from office, and some communities holding rallies supporting MacArthur and condemning the president. In Los Angeles, the city council adjourned for a day of mourning. In Baltimore, protesters hanged Truman in effigy. In Charlestown, West Virginia, the town decided to fire off the same number of blank rounds as MacArthur's age in tribute, and across the nation flags were lowered to half-staff as if a great leader had died rather than simply been fired for insubordination. Truman's approval rating, already low because of the stalemated war and various domestic scandals, plummeted to 22%, among the lowest ever recorded for an American president up to that time, and there were serious concerns about whether the constitutional order itself could survive the crisis if enough of the military or enough of the public decided to back MacArthur over their elected president. But Truman held firm, appearing at a press conference on April 12, 1951, where he calmly explained that MacArthur had been relieved because military commanders must be governed by the policies and directives issued to them in the manner provided by our laws and Constitution, adding that General MacArthur's place in history as one of our greatest commanders is fully established, but that the cause of world peace is more important than any individual. The president's plain-spoken defense of constitutional principles didn't immediately win over public opinion, but it did clarify what was at stake in a way that would resonate more clearly as the emotional heat of the moment began to cool. MacArthur's return to the United States after 14 years of absence became a triumphal procession that seemed designed to challenge Truman's authority through sheer public adulation. On April 17, 1951, MacArthur arrived in San Francisco to a hero's welcome, with an estimated 500,000 people lining the streets to see the general who many believed had been wronged by a small-minded politician. From there, he flew to Washington, where on April 19, 1951, he addressed a joint session of Congress in a speech that would become one of the most famous in American history, a masterpiece of rhetoric that blended military analysis, policy argument, and emotional manipulation with the skill of a man who understood the power of performance. Standing before Congress in his simple uniform without decorations, speaking in the measured tones that carried both authority and a hint of wounded dignity, MacArthur defended his conduct, argued for his strategic vision, and delivered his immortal conclusion: "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. The chamber erupted in applause and tears, with many congressmen openly weeping at what they perceived as the tragic end of a great man's service, and even those who supported Truman's decision found themselves moved by MacArthur's performance. From Washington, MacArthur proceeded to New York City on April 20, 1951, where an estimated 7 million people turned out for a ticker-tape parade that exceeded even the celebration that had greeted Eisenhower after World War II, with paper falling from buildings like snow and crowds so dense that the motorcade could barely proceed. For Truman and his advisers, watching this outpouring of public emotion for a man who had been fired for insubordination, it must have seemed that the constitutional crisis was deepening rather than resolving, that public sentiment might actually force the restoration of MacArthur or the removal of Truman, and that the principle of civilian control of the military might not survive its collision with a genuinely popular military hero. But the hearings that followed MacArthur's dramatic return would begin to shift public perception and vindicate Truman's judgment in ways that the immediate emotional reaction had obscured. Starting on May 3, 1951, the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee held joint hearings to investigate MacArthur's dismissal, with the general himself testifying for 3 days and presenting his case for expanding the war to China through blockades, bombing of Manchurian bases, and the use of nationalist Chinese troops. MacArthur was eloquent, confident, and detailed in his testimony, arguing that, in war there is no substitute for victory, and that the Truman administration's policy of limited war was a tragic error that only prolonged the conflict and increased casualties. But in the weeks of testimony that followed, as Secretary of Defense Marshall, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other military and civilian leaders presented their perspectives, a different picture emerged, one that revealed MacArthur's proposals as dangerously reckless, based on assumptions about Soviet intentions that no one could guarantee, and likely to trigger a wider war that could go nuclear at a time when the United States was still far stronger than the Soviet Union but not yet invulnerable to devastating retaliation. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one of the most respected military figures in America, delivered perhaps the most devastating critique of MacArthur's strategy on May 15, 1951, when he testified that expanding the war to China would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. A formulation that crystallized the administration's position in a way that was impossible to dismiss as mere political calculation. The hearings dragged on through May and into June 1951, with 42 days of testimony that filled more than 2 million words of transcript, and as the detailed military and strategic arguments unfolded in all their complexity, the public's initial emotional reaction to MacArthur's firing began to moderate. People started to understand that this wasn't simply a case of a great general being unfairly dismissed by a jealous politician, but rather a genuine conflict between two different visions of American strategy, two different understandings of presidential authority, and two different answers to the question of who should make decisions about war and peace in a democracy. As the summer of 1951 progressed, MacArthur did indeed begin to fade away, despite his initial plans for a continued public role and possible political career. There was talk of MacArthur running for president in 1952, and he briefly allowed supporters to organize a campaign, but the general who had seemed invincible in April appeared increasingly out of touch by July, his speeches recycling the same themes, his analysis of the Korean War frozen in the moment of his dismissal even as the situation evolved. The Korean War itself continued for 2 more years after MacArthur's relief, finally ending in an armistice signed on July 27, 1953, that essentially restored the pre-war boundary at the 38th parallel, not the total victory MacArthur had advocated, but also not the communist conquest of South Korea that he had warned would follow any policy of restraint. The limited war strategy that MacArthur had denounced as unprecedented and immoral became instead the template for American military engagement throughout the Cold War, from Korea to Vietnam to countless smaller conflicts where the United States used military force in pursuit of limited objectives rather than unconditional surrender. MacArthur spent his remaining years in New York, living at the Waldorf Towers, serving as chairman of the board of Remington Rand, giving occasional speeches, and watching as the historical judgment of his dismissal gradually shifted in Truman's favor even as MacArthur's military achievements in World War II remained undimmed. When MacArthur died on April 5, 1964, at the age of 84, he received the full honors of a state funeral, and presidents from both parties praised his military genius, but none suggested that Truman had been wrong to fire him, and the principle of civilian control of the military that Truman had defended at such enormous political cost was secure. Truman himself, who left office in 1953 with approval ratings still damaged by Korea and other controversies, lived long enough to see his reputation rehabilitated as historians came to appreciate his integrity, his decisiveness, and his willingness to make unpopular decisions in defense of constitutional principles, with the firing of MacArthur eventually recognized as one of the defining moments of his presidency. The confrontation between Truman and MacArthur established precedents and clarified principles that have shaped American civil-military relations ever since, creating guardrails that have held through subsequent crises and challenges. Every American general who has served since 1951 has understood that MacArthur's fate awaits anyone who thinks that military expertise or public popularity exempts them from subordination to civilian authority, and while there have been moments of tension, from Curtis LeMay's hawkishness during the Cuban Missile Crisis to Stanley McChrystal's ill-advised comments that led to his dismissal in 2010, none have approached the level of sustained insubordination that MacArthur practiced. The principle that wars should be fought in pursuit of political objectives defined by civilian leaders, rather than the military's own conception of victory, became embedded in American strategic thinking even as it was sometimes honored more in the breach than in the observance. The idea that a president could fire even the most celebrated military commander and have that decision upheld by the constitutional system, despite enormous public opposition, proved that American democracy was mature enough and resilient enough to subordinate military genius to civilian control even in wartime. Truman's decision required a kind of courage that is different from battlefield valor but no less essential to the survival of free government, the courage to be unpopular, to be second-guessed, to be burned in effigy and condemned by millions, all in defense of a principle that can seem abstract until the moment it is tested. MacArthur's tragedy was that a man who had given his entire adult life to military service, who had displayed genuine brilliance in battle and real vision in reshaping post-war Japan, could not ultimately accept the subordination that military service requires in a democracy, and his inability to bend to civilian authority destroyed the final chapter of a career that should have ended in undisputed glory. As we conclude this story, consider what would have happened if Truman had lacked the courage to fire MacArthur, if public opinion had forced the president to back down, if the general had been allowed to expand the war into China as he demanded. Would Chinese and American forces have fought a wider war in Manchuria, with casualties that would have dwarfed Korea's toll? Would the Soviet Union have honored its alliance with China and brought Russian forces into the conflict? Would the United States have used atomic weapons as MacArthur advocated, setting a precedent that might have made nuclear war routine rather than unthinkable? Would the principle of civilian control have been so weakened that future presidents would have found themselves hostage to their generals, unable to make strategic decisions without military approval? We cannot know the answers to these counterfactual questions, but we can see clearly what did happen. Truman fired MacArthur, survived the political firestorm, upheld the Constitution, and established that in America no general is too great to be dismissed for insubordination. This wasn't just a personal clash between two strong-willed men, though it was certainly that. It was a constitutional crisis that tested whether American democracy could subordinate military power to civilian authority even when the civilian was unpopular and the military commander was beloved. If you found this story valuable and believe these lessons still matter today, then subscribe to this channel because we need to remember how democracy survives its greatest tests. Hit that like button if you think courage sometimes means making unpopular decisions in defense of principle. Share this video with someone who needs to understand why civilian control of the military is not just a bureaucratic nicety but a fundamental safeguard of freedom. And leave a comment telling me what you found most surprising about this story, or what part of the MacArthur-Truman conflict you think is most relevant to our own time, because the conversation about power, accountability, and constitutional limits is one that every generation must have for itself.